Hear me out when I say this. Throughout gaming history, we've seen countless spin-offs. Some became successful enough to create entire franchises of their own, while others slowly faded into obscurity. Usually, a spin-off maintains a strong connection to its source material, but every now and then, a game comes along and leaves you wondering what the developers were even thinking. When you look at Street Fighter's history, most people assume the next game after the original was Street Fighter 2. After all, that's the game that revolutionized fighting games forever. But surprisingly, there was another Street Fighter game released before it, and for many people it feels like a fever dream. This wasn't another fighting game. This wasn't a tournament between world warriors. Instead, Capcom gave us a cybernetic, futuristic, alien hunting version of Kin Masters, jumping across planets and battling monstrous creatures in the year 2010. And no, I promise I am not making this up. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest chapters in Street Fighter's history, a game so bizarre that many fans don't even realize it exists. Welcome to episode 2 of the Street Fighter Takeover. Today, we're traveling to the future, or in this case, the past, as we take a look at Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight.
Let's get going.
Disgrace to your art.
Sure you can!
Are you ready for this? Attention!
Face the might. Worthless.
Imagine this, no gun, no knife. It's a one-on-one, son.
To those who know me, welcome back. And those who don't know me, welcome to the channel. I am the Retro Phantom, and I like to do deep dives into games that help make our childhoods and lives great. Right now, we're in the early stages of the Street Fighter Takeover, covering their games since we have the movie dropping this year. Now, if you enjoyed this video and want to tag along for the Street Fighter journey, I urge you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to stay up to date on all my latest uploads. If you want to support the channel, the best way is by liking and hyping the video, as it helps in the YouTube algorithm with smaller channels like mine. Also, if you're feeling generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description. And trust me, if you've never heard this game before, you're probably about to have the same reaction I did when I first discovered it exists. With that said, let's dive into this. Before we continue our journey through Street Fighter's franchise, let's quickly recap where it all began. If this is not your first Street Fighter video, feel free to advance past the recap, as seen on the timeline below. I'll give you a moment now. The original Street Fighter released in arcades in 1987 and marked Capcom's first true entry into the fighting game genre. Its development can be traced back to the creation of Capcom itself, following Kenzo Sugimoto's departure from Irem and the recruitment of developer Takashi Nishiyama, who previously worked on Kung Fu Master. Drawing inspiration from martial arts films such as Into the Dragon, games like Karate Champ and ER Kung Fu, as well as anime like Space Battleship Yamato, Nishiyama and his team created a worldwide martial arts tournament centered around two fighters, Ryu and Ken. While the game introduced many concepts that would define the franchise, including the special moves, characters, and the international roster, it was also an experimental title. The original arcade release featured pressure-sensitive controls that were eventually replaced with the now iconic 6-button layout that became a staple of the fighting game genre. Upon release, Street Fighter found moderate success in arcades, particularly in Japan, but it was often criticized for difficult controls and inconsistent special move inputs. Over time, the game became overshadowed by its legendary sequel, Street Fighter 2, which redefined nearly every aspect of the formula. Today, The original Street Fighter is remembered less for its gameplay and more for its historical significance. It may be rough around the edges, but it laid the foundation for one of the most influential fighting game franchises of all time. And now, with the groundwork established, let's actually move on to today. After the release of the original Street Fighter in '87, Capcom found themselves in an interesting position. The arcade game had introduced players to two iconic fighters, special moves, and the foundations of what would eventually become one of gaming's most successful franchises. However, unlike what many people assume, Capcom didn't immediately begin work on Street Fighter 2. Instead, development shifted away from Street Fighter creator Takashi Nishiyama. Nishiyama would eventually leave Capcom and later help create several influential fighting games at SNK, leaving the future of Street Fighter in the hands of other developers. I'll be getting deeper into that in my next video. One of those developers was Tokuro Fujiwara, a legendary Capcom producer and director known for his work on Ghosts and Goblins, Commando, Bionic Commando, and later, and this is a big one, Sweet Home. I'll be getting into that later. Rather than creating another one-on-one fighting game, Fujiwara's team took Street Fighter in a completely different direction. By the late 1980s, Nintendo's NES had become a massive success, and publishers were looking for recognizable arcade brands they could bring into players' living rooms.
Nintendo is about to bring their popular Famicom video game console to US shores, and the odds are stacked against them.
The game industry was in turmoil.
And into that terrible market, suddenly Nintendo, a Japanese newcomer, comes in and has a new console and says, hey everybody, let's play games again.
Capcom had already found success adapting many of its arcade properties to home consoles, and the company saw value in using established names to help market new experiences. The result was Street Fighter 2010: The Final Fight, a futuristic action platformer released exclusively for the NES in North America in 1990. Instead of martial arts tournaments and world warriors, players would control a cybernetically enhanced hero fighting alien creatures across multiple planets in a distant future setting. What's fascinating is that the game wasn't originally conceived as a Street Fighter title. In Japan, the game was released as simply 2010 Street Fighter, featuring a protagonist named Kevin Straker. For the North American release, Capcom altered the story and marketing, transforming Kevin into Ken and presenting the game as a distant sequel to the original Street Fighter. The decision created one of the strangest entries in the franchise history. Players experiencing another fighting game found themselves playing a fast-paced sci-fi action game that had almost nothing in common with the original arcade classic. Yet, despite its bizarre connection to Street Fighter, the game remains an interesting snapshot of an era when publishers were still experimenting with how to turn successful arcade brands into home console experiences. Unlike the first Street Fighter 2010 actually has a story. The strange thing is that depending on which version of the game you're playing, you may have a completely different protagonist. Like I said earlier, in Japan, players take control of a cybernetic police officer named Kevin Straker. His mission is to hunt down dangerous parasitic life forms that spread throughout multiple worlds, destroying them before they can consume entire civilizations. However, if you're playing the North American version, things get a lot weirder. According to the game's manual, our protagonist is none other than Ken Masters. Yes, that Ken Masters from the original Street Fighter. Apparently, after winning the Street Fighter tournament in 25 years earlier, Ken retired from fighting, enrolled at a university, and became a scientist specializing in the field of cybernetic. While studying there, Ken befriended a fellow scientist named Troy. Together, the two developed a revolutionary substance known as cyberplasm, a material capable of making living beings several times stronger than normal. As humanity expanded beyond Earth and began colonizing other worlds, the discovery seemed like it could benefit countless people across the galaxy. That all changed one day when Ken arrived at his laboratory and found it in ruins. Troy had been murdered. The cyberplasm had been stolen, and the killer had escaped into the frontier worlds beyond Earth. Determined to avenge his friend and recover the stolen creation, Ken enhanced his body with cybernetic technology and set out across the galaxy to track down the culprit. As Ken traveled from planet to planet, he discovers traces of cyberplasm everywhere he goes. Strange creatures and hostile life forms have been transformed by its power, forcing Ken to battle through increasingly dangerous worlds while following the trail left behind Troy's killer. Throughout his journey, a mysterious figure repeatedly contacts Ken, warning him to abandon his pursuit. At the same time, Ken begins suffering from unexplained pain throughout his body, suggesting there's far more to this conspiracy than he realizes. Eventually, Ken discovers the shocking truth. Troy was never murdered. He staged his own death, stole the cyberplasm, and spread it throughout the galaxy in an effort to create an army of enhanced superhumans under his control. Even worse, Troy secretly implanted cyberplasm into Ken's own body, meaning the strange pain Ken has been experiencing throughout his journey is a result of the substance slowly affecting him as well. After a final confrontation, Ken defeats Troy and puts it into his plans, returning to Earth, as he begins a difficult task of containing the spread of cyberplasm before it can consume the galaxy. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. How do we go from a martial arts tournament in the original Street Fighter to a cybernetic scientist Ken masters fighting alien monsters across multiple planets? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. At its core, Street Fighter 2010 is an action platformer, though at certain points it even shifts into an auto-scrolling shooter-like experience. As I mentioned earlier, depending on which region you're playing, you're either controlling one or two different guys, Kevin or Ken. But regardless of the name attached to the character, the gameplay remains exactly the same. The game takes place across a series of alien worlds, with each stage challenging players to defeat enemies, collect energy, and open a portal to the next area. Unlike traditional platformers where the objective is simply reaching the end of a level, Street Fighter 2010 requires players to actively hunt down enemies scattered throughout each environment. Defeating these creatures fills an indicator known as the open meter, and once every arrow is illuminated, a teleport portal opens somewhere within the stage. The catch is the portal only remains open for a limited amount of time. If you fail to reach it before it closes, you'll lose a life and must try again. This creates a constant sense of urgency, forcing players to balance exploration, combat, and platforming while racing against the clock. Before each stage begins, the game identifies a specific target for you to eliminate. In some levels, a single target is enough to generate the energy required for the portal, while later stages may require hunting down multiple targets before you can even advance. The objective-based structure gives each stage a sense of purpose beyond simply reaching the end of a level. Controlling your character is surprisingly simple on paper. The A button is used for jumping, while the B button handles attacks. However, mastering movement is where much of the game's challenge comes from. Pressing the jump a second time while airborne allows your character to grab onto walls, cliffs, plants, and other vertical surfaces. This wall grabbing mechanic becomes essential as levels grow more complex, often requiring players to leap between narrow platforms while avoiding enemies and environmental hazards. Movement is expanded even further through the use of aerobic flip jumps by performing a neutral jump and changing direction mid-air. Players can execute a backward flip, allowing them to reposition themselves and reach areas that would otherwise be difficult to access. As the game progresses, mastering these movement options becomes just as important as the combat itself. Combat is equally straightforward but offers more depth than you might expect. Depending on your position and directional input, attacks can change between punches, kicks, and various martial arts techniques. The manual even encourages players to experiment with different directional combinations while attacking in order to discover additional moves and attack patterns. One thing worth noting is that neither version of the protagonist is an ordinary human. Whether you're playing as Kevin or Ken, both characters have enhanced themselves with supernatural cybernetic technology. These bionic upgrades help maintain the superhuman agility, wall climbing abilities, and powerful energy attacks you'll be using throughout the adventure. Players can fire in multiple directions, launch powerful curve shots, and even attack diagonally while airborne. Some attacks require specific movement techniques to perform, such as firing downward after executing a flip jump. encouraging players to combine platforming and combat together. Despite using only 2 buttons, Street Fighter 2010 gives players a surprising amount of control over their attacks. Your primary weapon isn't actually traditional martial arts, but rather an energy projectile that can be fired in multiple directions. Players can shoot horizontally, fire directly upward, launch powerful curve shots for additional range, and even attack diagonally using aerial kicks and aerobic maneuvers. As a result, the combat often feels closer to a running gun action game than anything resembling the original Street Fighter. Progression is also tied to a power-up system. Throughout each stage, players can discover capsules hidden inside destructible containers. Containing these capsules gradually increases your attack level, extending the range of your projectiles while also boosting your damage output. The stronger you become, the easier it is to deal with the increasingly aggressive enemies found on other planets. Every 2 capsules collected increases your weapon level by 1, allowing players to build their firepower to 5 total levels. As your strength grows, attacks travel farther, hit harder, and make dealing with tougher enemies significantly easier. Of course, there is a catch. Taking damage causes your power level to drop, meaning mistakes can quickly undo your progress. Losing a life is even more punishing, resetting your character back to their default strength and forcing you to rebuild your arsenal from scratch. Because of this, survival becomes just as important as offense, rewarding players who can navigate levels carefully while avoiding unnecessary damage. Additionally, upgrades can also be found throughout the adventure, including support options that provide extra firepower and specialized abilities that allow players to damage enemies through certain movement techniques. These upgrades become increasingly valuable as the game's difficulty ramps up and the enemy encounters become more demanding. One of the more unusual upgrades is the Flip Shield capsule, which allows players to damage enemies through their aerobic flip maneuvers. It's a small addition, but it further reinforces the game's focus on combining movement and combat rather than treating them as separate mechanics. One thing I actually appreciate about Street Fighter 2010 is that despite being an NES title, the game does make an effort to give each world its own identity. Rather than simply moving from stage to stage, players travel across a series of different planets, each with its own hazards, enemies, and environmental themes. The adventure begins on Earth, which serves as a sort of tutorial world. Here you'll encounter cyborg criminals and get familiar with the game's movement and combat systems before venturing deeper into the frontier. From there, things start getting a little interesting. The second planet is Tatooine, a forest owned by hostile creatures and parasites. Now, if you think the name sounds a bit familiar, trust me when I say you're not alone. Many fans are pointing out the obvious similarity to Tatooine from Star Wars. The references doesn't stop there because the very next world is Dagobah, which bears a striking resemblance to Dagobah, the swamp planet where Luke Skywalker trained with Yoda in The Empire Strikes Back. Ironically, the English version changes Dagobah to a desert environment known as the Sand Dune, making the Star Wars inspiration even stranger considering Dagobah itself was a swamp world. Whether these similarities were intentional references or simply coincidental naming choices, they're hard to ignore when looking back at the game today. As the journey continues, players will visit Walt, a water-covered planet filled with aquatic threats and giant creatures lurking beneath the surface. Beyond that, Mos Eisley, a massive mechanical world dedicated to researching the parasites, giving the game an increasingly science fiction feel as the adventure progresses. For a game carrying the Street Fighter name, the sheer variety of alien environments is honestly one of the strongest qualities. Each planet introduces new enemy types, hazards, and platforming challenges, helping the adventure feel much larger than this NES hardware might initially suggest. If you spent any amount of time looking up Street Fighter 2010 online, you've probably heard people describe it as one of the hardest on the NES. Much of that reputation comes from players discovering the game through Angry Video Game Nerd Review, which portrayed the game as an almost impossible experience. After playing it myself, I think the truth is a little bit more complicated. There's no question that Street Fighter 2010 can be frustrating. The game expects precise platforming, enemy attacks, and can quickly drain your health. And perhaps the most punishing of all, your health isn't automatically restored between stages. If you barely survive on one level, you'll carry that damaged health bar into the next one, combined with the fact that losing a life resets your power level, the game can create this vicious cycle where recovering from mistakes becomes increasingly difficult. The portal system can also feel unnecessarily punishing at times. Once enough enemies have been defeated, the portal opens and players are given only a short amount of time to reach it. Miss the portal, you lose a life, regardless of how well you perform throughout the rest of the stage. It's one of the several design choices that can make the game feel harder than it actually is. However, the more I played, the more I started to realize that many of the game's challenges come from awkward design decisions rather than truly demanding gameplay. A great example is the combat system itself. While the movement options are surprisingly advanced for an NES title, the shooting mechanics can feel restrictive. The inability to attack in certain directions and the awkward projectile controls occasionally make encounters more frustrating than challenging. Ironically, the boss battles suffer from the opposite problem. Many of the bosses can be completely broken once you understand how the AI works. Rather than adapting to the player's actions, several bosses follow predictable movement patterns that can be manipulated with positioning alone. By standing on certain platforms, corners, or specific locations within the area, players can often trap bosses in repetitive loops where they repeatedly miss their attacks or fail to properly approach the player. As a result, most of the intimidating bosses in the game can be defeated by simply finding a safe spot and repeatedly firing attacks until their health is depleted. Because the bosses never really adapt to the player's strategies, techniques discovered early in the game remain effective throughout the entire adventure, including some of the final encounters. For that reason, I don't think Street Fighter 2010 is necessarily the impossible nightmare that its reputation suggests. Instead, it feels like a game filled with good ideas that weren't always executed properly. The movement mechanics are genuinely impressive, the level variety is respectable, and there's a solid action platform hidden underneath it all. Unfortunately, inconsistent design choices, awkward combat, and exploitable boss encounters prevent it from reaching its full potential. Looking back on Street Fighter 2010 today, I think the biggest thing working against it is the name. At Capcom released it as an original science fiction action platformer, I honestly think people would remember it much more fondly. The problem is that when you put Street Fighter on the box, players naturally expect martial arts, tournaments, rivalries, and one-on-one combat. Instead, they got a cybernetic hero blasting alien monsters across multiple planets. It's a hard sell no matter how good the game is. With that said, I don't think Street Fighter 2010 is nearly as bad as its reputation would suggest. The movement mechanics are surprisingly advanced for an NES game. The level variety keeps the adventure from becoming stale, and there are some genuinely creative ideas hidden beneath the surface. Unfortunately, many of those ideas are held back by frustrating design choices, the limited combat options, unforgiving health management, awkward progression systems, and exploitable boss encounters prevent the game from reaching heights it probably could have achieved. If you're coming into this game expecting Street Fighter, you'll likely walk away disappointed. But if you approach it as a standalone action platformer from the late 80s, there's actually a decent game here that's worth checking out for the sheer novelty alone. At the very least, Street Fighter 2010 remains one of the strangest chapters in Capcom's history. It's a bizarre experiment that somehow transformed Ken Masters from a world warrior into a cybernetic space-faring scientist hunting monsters across a galaxy. And honestly, that's probably enough reason to experience it at least once. Upon release, Street Fighter 2010 received somewhat of a mixed response from critics. In Japan, Famitsu awarded the game scores 5, 7, 7, and 6 out of 10 from its overall review panel, resulting in a score that suggested a respectable but far from exceptional experience. At the time, many players viewed the game as less as a continuation of Street Fighter and more as a standalone action platformer. This was especially true in Japan with the name change. But as the years went on, very much of the conversation surrounding Street Fighter 2010 shifted away from its gameplay and towards its bizarre connection to the Street Fighter franchise. Players who discovered the game after the success of Street Fighter 2 were often confused by the drastic change in genre, setting, and tone. Retrospective reviews frequently criticize Capcom's decision to market the North American version as a Street Fighter sequel. Publications such as GameSpot pointed to the unusual location changes that transformed Ken into a futuristic Ken, while others question how a science fiction action platformer became associated with the series known for martial arts tournaments and world warriors. OneUp.com would later describe the game as a bastard offshoot of the original Street Fighter franchise and a nightmare of a terrible localization, reflecting the frustration many fans felt towards the drastic story changes made for Western audiences. At the same time, not every retrospective assessment was entirely negative. Some critics argued that Street Fighter 2010 wasn't necessarily a bad game, rather a victim of unrealistic expectations. Screw Attack notably remarked that while the game was extremely difficult, it wasn't inherently terrible and likely would have been judged more fairly if it had not carried the Street Fighter name. And honestly, that's the most accurate way to see it. Street Fighter 2010 isn't remembered because it's one of the best games on the NES. It's remembered because it's one of the strangest games that Capcom ever attached to Street Fighter. Between the futuristic setting, the cyborg protagonist, the Star Wars inspired planets, and the infamous localization changes, the game feels less like a sequel and more like an alternate universe experiment. I mean, looking deeper into player impressions over the years, a fairly consistent pattern begins to emerge. Even among players who disliked the game, there was often an acknowledgement that Street Fighter 2010 had some genuinely interesting ideas. Many praised the movement mechanics, and especially the ability to climb, hang from ledges, and perform aerobic backflips. For the NES game, title released in 1990, that amount of mobility available to the players was surprisingly advanced and helped distinguish it from many of its contemporaries. The graphics and atmosphere also received positive remarks. Reviewers often compared the visual quality to late generation NES titles like Mega Man 4, noting that alien creatures, environments, and mutated enemies were detailed and memorable. Likewise, the soundtrack was frequently praised for maintaining a constant sense of tension and urgency as players raced against timers and fought through increasingly dangerous planets. Unfortunately, many of the same reviewers also highlighted several recurring frustrations. The most common criticism centered around combat. While players appreciated the movements available, many felt the attack system lacked the same level of flexibility. Attacking downward required specific inputs, diagonal attacks felt awkward to use, and certain enemy placements seemed designed to exploit those limitations. As a result, combat is often more restrictive than the game's movement system would suggest. Difficulty was another divisive topic. Some players view Street Fighter 2010 as brutally challenging, while others argued that the game's reputation was exaggerated. Rather than being difficult because of sophisticated enemy design, critics often pointed towards the cheap enemy placements, punishing health management, and mechanics that could feel unfair until they're fully understood. For better or worse, Street Fighter 2010 remains a fascinating footnote in Street Fighter's history, a game that dared to do something completely different long before Street Fighter 2 would define what the franchise was actually meant to be. Being completely honest, before starting the Street Fighter Takeover, I had never even heard of Street Fighter 2010. After researching it, I can understand exactly why. This isn't one of the most beloved games attached to the Street Fighter name, and trying to research it was honestly a challenge in itself. There are barely, if any, interviews, almost no behind the scenes information, no development postmortems, and barely any coverage compared to the other Capcom titles from the era. It's actually kind of crazy. Then again, it's also understandable. If I had the opportunity to sit down with Toguro Fujiwara, I probably want to ask him about Sweet Home, Ghosts and Goblins, or Resident Evil long before I'd ever ask him about Street Fighter 2010. The more I played this game, the more I became convinced that its biggest problem isn't the gameplay, it's the title. Just imagine if this game had simply been called 2010 and released in 1990 as an original science fiction action platformer. I think people will look back on it differently. We probably laugh at some of the futuristic predictions and say this is what people thought the future would look like. Instead, the conversation almost becomes, why is this even a Street Fighter game? And that's a fair question. Look, I'm a sucker for those turn off your brain games where you can just focus on the action, listen to some music, and enjoy the experience for what it is. Street Fighter 2010 scratches that itch at times, but no matter how I try to judge it on its own merits, I keep coming back to the same conclusion. This game has almost nothing to do with Street Fighter. What's funny is that Japan seemed to understand that from the beginning. The original version starred Kevin Straker and was largely stood as his own sci-fi action game. It was only when it came overseas that Capcom decided to force a connection akin for marketing purposes. And honestly, that's not the first time I've seen something like this. While I'm playing Street Fighter 2010, I keep thinking about games like Snake's Revenge and Metal Gear 2. One felt like a product created to capitalize on the name. The other felt like an authentic continuation of the franchise. I even look back to Mortal Kombat Special Forces. When I covered that game, I said something very similar. If you remove the Mortal Kombat branding, you'd be left with an average action game instead of one of the most infamous entries in the series. That same logic applies here. As a Street Fighter game, I think Street Fighter 2010 misses the mark completely. If you're coming into this expecting martial arts tournaments, rivalries, and the foundation for Street Fighter 2, you're probably going to hate it. But if you remove the expectations and judge it purely as a late era NES action platformer, it's honestly just an average game. Not terrible, not amazing, just average. And that's really what this game taught me. Street Fighter 2010 is a perfect example of expectations versus reality. The reality is that there's a decent little action game hidden here. The expectation is that it's supposed to be a Street Fighter game. And that's where Street Fighter 2010 ultimately falls short. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I know this episode was a bit shorter than some of my usual retrospectives, but Street Fighter 2010 is still a unique and important chapter in Street Fighter's history, even if it's one of the strangest. But if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like. It really helps smaller channels like mine grow and tells YouTube that this content is worth sharing with other communities. And next week, we are finally getting into the game that changed everything, Street Fighter 2. The game that revolutionized fighting games forever. If you want to be there when that video drops, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss it. And if you're feeling generous, you can always buy me a cup of coffee. The link is in the description. With that said, this is the Retro Phantom, signing out.